kind of a reductionism, a privatization of religion characteristic of thinkers since the Enlightenment. It was Jesus who said, "A little leaven leavens the whole loaf." It really doesn't take much to end up in a shadow mission. As Robert Bell and associates have convincingly demonstrated, Americans, and maybe especially American educators, have been caught up in what they call the grip of expressive individualism. The grip of expressive individualism. That is the antithesis of a corporate mission that's needed for a church-related college to function as a team, as a group, to reach common goals. When I read that book, The Dying of the Light, I came out with a surprisingly strong conviction. And it's a conviction about our own beloved Lindsey Wilson College. And it was not here, not now, and not on our watch. In the Old Testament, it was the task of the priests to ensure that the fire never went out on the altar. If you don't guard the flame, eventually the fire goes out. And we keep the flame alive, and all of us, every one of us here, that you are a bridge builder. We're each bridge builders between God and human beings, together in an educational mission at a liberal arts college trying to improve lives. And we have a president and a cabinet and a board of trustees that have that desire, as Troy has mentioned and as Dr. Lucky has mentioned, to be most intentionally church-related. We sincerely want to do it right here. We don't want it to be a shadow mission. We want it to be a place of true academic freedom, of truth speakers and truth seekers, people who speak the truth in love, with clarity and with charity. You know, it was from Dr. John Begley that I first heard the term mission-driven. Had you ever heard that before, Dr. Lucky, before you ever met John Begley? Mission-driven, meaning that your mission is not an add-on. Your mission is the fuel that propels the institution. It lights the flame on the altar where we give our lives to God each day. I'm one of those, I don't know if you do this, but I tend to mark events and I'll look at my calendar, and I realized it was 25 years ago this month that Dr. John Begley invited me to be part of the Lindsey Wilson team. And I had admired Dr. Begley for years, and there was nothing that I wouldn't do for him. There was nothing he wouldn't do for me. So for years, we did nothing for each other. But finally, I caught on to the vision, and at 31 years of age, I signed up at Lindsey Wilson College. And President Lucky will very well remember the very lengthy cabinet meetings we had 20-plus years ago, where we would spend hours upon hours thinking through every single word in our mission statement, as we were about reinventing the sleepy little junior college of 500 students, become a burgeoning baccalaureate and eventually a graduate degree-granting institution. In fact, if you look back at our promotional literature from the 80s, and I think we've still got some of those, those literature out there now, you can look and you can see the pictures, and yes, your Lindsey Wilson staff was younger and slimmer and had more hair. Dr. Gerald Chafin, my good friend, tells me that growing bald is like going to heaven. He says it's bright and it's shiny and there'll be no more parting. And so you can see how your staff has aged over the years, but if you look back at that advertising literature, there was a phrase that we used. It was like a motto that was on all of our literature, and it said, a degree of difference. A degree of difference. And of course, it did refer to the college degree. That was a play on words, but it also referred to that degree of difference as to how you would be treated as a student at Lindsey Wilson College. And I am intrigued that our college mission statement is primarily about the development of an atmosphere. Our mission statement says we're creating an atmosphere of active caring and Christian concern. And that very much comes out of this Methodist heritage that Reverend Darren Brandon was talking about. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was a professor. He was an academician as well as a minister. And he showed true tolerance when he said, we think and we let think. But he also understood the need to share in the mission, and he did it ecumenically. He said, if Christ is your Lord, he said, give me your hand. You're my brother or my sister. We have this common task. It is an atmosphere we create here. It's more about demonstration than it is doctrine. Why do we treat student, every day as we do? Because God does. Dr. Starr read from our Old Testament lesson in Psalm 145. You want to understand what God is like? It says God is gracious. God is full of compassion, of great mercy, slow to anger, and it says God is good to all persons. And so all students are treated redemptively, whether you're a 30 ACT high school valedictorian or you're a student who is socially promoted through high school and needs to take our entire battery of developmental coursework. We are good to all. We bless those who curse us, and maybe especially since the midterm grades have just come out. We forgive. We love in ways that promote well-being, even when it's having to speak to a student directly about missing classes or an assignment or misbehavior on campus, and even when we have to send students home. We do it with kindness. It's why professors and residence hall directors and coaches and advisors agonize over their students, because we so want them to succeed and make good choices. Every student, every day. That's why I had Dr. Scott read today one of my favorite gospel stories. There's several stories about Jesus healing people with blindness in the Gospels. But in this particular story, I don't know, it's sort of like a half a miracle, but Jesus touches the eyes of this man whose eyes are blind, and the man says, I see, but I see men like trees walking. In other words, it's still a blur. He doesn't see clearly yet. And so Jesus touches his eyes a second time, and then he can see clearly. We are people here at Lindsey Wilson whose eyes have been twice touched. We no longer see students walking by us in a blur, like trees walking. We see them as individuals, as special in God's sight. And our mission reminds us of this. You see, people in academics, folks wearing these robes, above all, we understand that ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences in history. We're in history creating an atmosphere of Christian concern. You understand, I think, that in many countries of the world, there are no ministries, no services, no atmosphere of compassion for the poor, for the unfortunate, for the differently abled. And there's a reason for that. It is a natural extension of that nation's philosophies and religions. If you're poor, if you're down and out, if you're physically ill, if you're disenfranchised, if you're from the wrong side of the tracks, that's your fate. It's your karma. It's the will of God. So leave them in that situation. The philosophy is lived out. Ideas have consequences. It was Edward Gibbons, the esteemed historian, who wrote that if you truly want to understand a major world religion or philosophy, he said, be a pragmatist. Don't buy a book. Buy a ticket. Buy a ticket and go visit the countries of the world who practice that religion or philosophy and see how they treat the oppressed, the marginalized, the voiceless. See how women and children are treated. Buy a ticket, not a book. See what countries of the world people flee from and what countries of the world people flock or immigrate to. Maybe immigration is the most sincere form of flattery. I did that for Dr. Chafin. Ideas have consequences. William James, sometimes called the father of American psychology, said we should measure religion not by its roots, but by its fruits. What comes about when it is practiced? One of my favorite writers, Philip Yancey, tells of having a wonderful opportunity years ago to be with a group of journalists who got to interview Mother Teresa. And as he sat with that group of journalists, a newspaper man from the New York Times raised his hand. He was wearing a three-piece suit, and he asked a question that caused Mother Teresa to pause. Here was his question. Mother Teresa, why not instead attend to people worthy of rehabilitation? What kind of success rate could your hospital boast of when most of your patients die in a matter of days or weeks?